There is a saying we all know: don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. John Muir is partially known for walking 1,000 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. I won't be walking that many miles in his shoes, yet we will still try to examine the rest of Muir's life, his writings, his actions, and how they have an impact on the environmental movement in the United States today. My name is Dory Robinson, and this is Tree Speech, a podcast where we practice hearing the forest through the trees. This week's episode was written and recorded in Massachusetts, on the native lands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, Pennacook, Massachusett, and Pawtucket people, in New York on the land of the Lenapee tribes, as well as on the lands of the Iroquoian Mohawks and Algonquin Mahicans. Tree Speech is co-written and produced by Jonathan Zautner. Let's continue our journey with Muir. Once settled in Yosemite, Muir spent years where he often fell into periods of anguish due to his lack of career prospects. Yet he always found encouragement and enlightenment in the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson. A champion of individualism and transcendentalism, Emerson was, at the time, the most widely known man of letters. Poems, essays, lectures. Emerson stated that true genius comes from those who turn away from the pressures of a group and lies within those who can listen to their own thoughts and instincts. His words influenced others to live more independent lives, the very lifestyle Muir was living. With only a tin cup, a handful of tea, a loaf of bread, and a copy of Emerson, John Muir was known to travel throughout Yosemite alone. Over a period of years, Muir became respected in the valley for his guiding skills, knowledge of natural history, and vivid storytelling. With an insatiable curiosity, Muir studied glaciers and botany, amongst other natural elements. His studies took him throughout the Sierra and even all the way up to Glacier Bay, Alaska, to be guided by the Native American community along the Stickeen River, during which he noted in his scientific observations well over 300 glaciers along its course. Word of Muir's knowledge spread such that travelers would visit Yosemite in hopes of being guided by him. In 1871, Emerson, with a number of academic friends from Boston, arrived in Yosemite and the two met. They became fast friends and exchanged correspondence until Emerson's death. Pressured to return to society, Muir went to Oakland, where his lifelong friend, Jean Carr, introduced him to Louisa Strentzel, the woman who, in 1880, would become his wife. For the next 10 years, Muir managed Louisa's family orchards while raising daughters, Wanda and Helen. Even so, Muir's heart remained wild. Louisa understood this and was known to shoo him back up to the mountains whenever he became restless. The more time Muir spent in the natural world, the more he referred to nature as home. Though born into the Western thought that we are separate from nature, Muir inched closer to a more indigenous way of thinking when he explored the idea that we are all intertwined. People, nature, land, animals, all of us. Muir wanted to protect his home, the natural world, and so began his work as a preservationist. At the time, there was only one national park, Yellowstone. Muir focused his efforts in establishing more national parks and campaigned to have Yosemite turned from a state park to a national one, preserving it from eager loggers and the lumber industry. Muir's published essays caught the eyes of many nature lovers who in turn wrote letters to Congress petitioning for Yosemite's preservation. Finally, in October 1890, Yosemite National Park was created. Muir consistently fought economically driven philosophies about the environment that were radically different than his. In short, preservation versus conservation. Muir was not the only activist eager to preserve the land. In early 1892, Muir was contacted to form a club for mountain lovers, and the Sierra Club was born. He He was elected president and remained so until his death 22 years later. During his tenure, they held educational and scientific meetings in which the idea was discussed to establish a national forest reservation. In 1903, Muir and President Theodore Roosevelt went camping high above Yosemite Valley. Muir called for Roosevelt's help to preserve the trees and the beauty of the region. Roosevelt was so impressed with both Muir and his experience in Yosemite that his conservationist stance was further emboldened. Over the rest of Roosevelt's administration, he set aside 148 million acres of forest reserves, and the number of national parks doubled. Muir did not win all his battles, however. The Sierra Club and the government were ingrained in a 7-year struggle over the Hetch Hetchy, a valley, reservoir, and water system in the northwestern part of Yosemite National Park. Finally, in 1913, the valley was dammed to provide a water source for San Francisco. All of this sounds romantic and inspiring. A man who was raised in a strict religious world and yet grew spiritually to become a steward for Mother Nature. But people are much more complicated. It would be easy to imagine Muir as simply reading Emerson by campfire, gaining lifelong friendships with Native Americans, and fighting Congress tirelessly. In July 2020, the Sierra Club's executive director at that time, Michael Brune, wrote an article entitled "Pulling Down Our Monuments," in which he states that Muir, quote, made derogatory comments about Black people and Indigenous peoples that drew on deeply harmful racist stereotypes. In short, the executive director of the Sierra Club denounced its founder. We wanted to speak with someone deeply informed about this sensitive issue. We were so very fortunate to have spoken with a scholar and activist on these subjects, Aaron Mair. Aaron is an environmentalist and past president of the Sierra Club. He has advised 2 presidents and Congress. Muir was the organization's first African-American president. Aaron, along with Chad Henson and Mary Ann Nelson, co-wrote a scholarly article entitled "Who is John Muir, Really?" for Earth Island Journal, stating that the Sierra Club's actions could cause divisions within the environmental movement. We'll have a link to that article in the show notes. Currently, he is the director of the Adirondack Council's new policy initiative, Forever Adirondacks, which will lead the call to federal and state officials for more funding and policy measures around clean water, jobs, and wilderness protection. Aaron took time on a very busy day to speak with me between meetings, and I was so appreciative for his time and insights. Here's my conversation with Aaron Mair. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. I know today is an extremely busy day, so we're all the more appreciative that you're taking your time to be with us right now.
Well, it's the most important time whenever you can start to speak to a place that's uplifting and empowering for communities of color, LGBTQ communities, and things that are centering on our needs in this society at this so-called moment where we're at that intersection where hate is actually becoming socialized as a good, right? And then, like I said, they're literally are destroying books. So anything that teaches history, American history, is now being propagandized and messaged as traumatizing and causing harms to those people who want their children to be the future fascists of America. So this is indeed a tough time. And so I appreciate the opportunity for being on this podcast, joining you and Jonathan. As I say, let's kick the song around a little bit.
You're such a passionate, inspiring person, and you're specifically an inspirational pioneer in environmental justice, and you've been a lifelong advocate, teacher, organizer, and leader. Where did this love and appreciation and drive for environmental causes first begin?
Well, it's a great question. And I step into this space because my daughters were poisoned. I'm a father whose children, whose babies were injured. And so in 1987, I discovered that the community that I decided to live in, the community of color, as I say, the Lord doesn't put us anywhere that we don't belong. And I absolutely built a house on the corner of a nature preserve that happened to be upwind from a garbage incinerator. So a solid waste incinerator burning garbage for an 8-county upstate region of mostly white suburban trash burned in the Black community. And my house happened to be right in the wind of it. And my daughters developed something called environmental asthma. So there's genetic, induced asthma, where your genetic markers and triggers that you pass on to generation to generation. But many people don't realize that anybody can be induced to have asthmatic reactions, or your body's immune system reacting to poisons and toxins, even though you don't have a genetic risk, but you have the environmental risk. So there's, environmental risk and genetic risk, they intertwine. So the environment can absolutely trigger genetic risk. So when that happened, I'm a retired epidemiologist from the New York State Health Department. So I ended up applying my science and skill to do the research and find out what was going on. Why did my daughters have something that clearly that her adult parents don't have and don't have markers for? And so we were able to trace it to the incinerator. And then this was within the summer of after building my home, we were out having a cookout out back, and all of a sudden these black flakes were coming down everywhere. And so we realized that, we were dealing with all this pollution. That's how I got involved and became an activist. I went out, knocked on doors, neighbors, seeing who else was suffering. We did a community-based survey. We identified a lot of people. So at the end of the day, when you realize not only your kids, but your neighbors are exposed, and then what's the source? You find out it's an incinerator. The incinerator, what's called state-of-the-art, was the place that was providing climate control for the entire New York State government. So the governor's mansion, the judiciary, state Supreme Court, the assembly, the museum, all these things were benefiting from this garbage incinerator at the expense of the health of children and the Black community in Arbor Hill, literally the state capitol's front door. And so my efforts and work in my research led me to other titans, people who would become titans in the movement.
How, after you learned all these things, what made you say, I'm going to focus some of this effort to the Sierra Club?
I went to the Sierra Club because as a walk and as a professional, as an expert, one of the things, I'm the son of a labor rights shop steward. My father's a UAW shop steward. He worked at General Motors in Terrytown. So he was an organizer. He was a labor organizer and a civil rights activist, So my dad always had the mantra that if you're going to take on the man or take on the big systems, you got to make yourself a 5,000-pound gorilla. You got to make yourself an institution. And that has always been sound strategic advice. So you don't do it alone. You know that you cannot go into a battle alone. You got to build a movement. You got to be part of a movement, or basically go into a movement, and hopefully you can privateer some of their ships away to your cause. A colleague of mine, a work colleague, said, who was a Sierra Club member, said, hey, man, we actually have a solid waste campaign. So he asked me to make a pitch to the Sierra Club, which I agreed to do. And I thanked him because that was the kind of solidarity that I needed. And so I went down to New York City to make that pitch to the Sierra Club. So when I walked in the room, they were all white. Everybody's head immediately turned and the room went quiet. And I just said, well, maybe it's the bass in my voice or the fact that I'm 6'7", So you try to give people the benefit of the doubt. So you go in there and you make an impassioned presentation about solid waste. So I knew the soup to the nuts and the science behind solid waste, what they did. So I figured I'm speaking to a home crowd and driving home that point. And so unfortunately, when it came to questions and answers, one of the first questions was by a white woman within the room, and asked me, well, did you go to the NAACP and ask them for help? And that's what kind of keeping my jaw from dropping from my face is like, I'm talking about environment. I'm talking about something that they do, something that is one of their tier 1 issues. And this woman is clearly looking at my race and saying, well, yeah, you got a problem. Yeah, it's environmental, but when you're supposed to go to Black people, I said, the environment is Black environment and white environment. So this really drove in that work that was already going on, and plus me participating in the People of Color Summit and all the other things. So we were already operating amongst radical, this whole new environmental justice culture. So that's also radicalizing me. And then I'm sitting here listening to environmental racism, not from the point of zoning and land use policy and citing. I'm looking at it from the the so-called grassroots environmental activists. This is the other side of environmental racism, is where who are my friends and who are my enemies? Well, we already know the polluters are my enemies, but who would have thought that the environmental activists, their racism is also hitting them and seeing me as other as well. And that was a real powerful gust of cold wind. I won't say slap in the face, because we already saw enough slapping with Will and Chris. But it was one of those things that was very, very eye-opening. They ended up voting it down. They voted not to support us and not to help us. And so not only was I, felt the tinge of racial bias, but it was then underscored by, like any zoning or land use pattern where it comes to people of color, you don't matter. And so my color may be the wrong complexion for protection and support. The weekend after that meeting, the brothers showed up at my house with another couple of other Sierra Club members, and they had a campaign sign, and they just said, we're going to break with we had a local group, and we're going to break, give the solidarity, and we're going to raise the money, and we're going to be there. And he gave me a check for $250. That was the first donation to our movement, to our struggle. And I thanked him, man. I gave him a hug, and I told him, I said, let me tell you something. I'm going to pay this back. I said, I promise you, once we're done with this battle, once we win, I'm going to join the Sierra Club, but I'm going to join it with the intention of making sure people like that turn me away will never turn away another community of color again. So, I was disrespected by the Sierra Club. I was not welcome to the Sierra Club. And I came in based upon the radical action that in spirit of a person who had his heart in the right place. And I leveraged that moment of that spark of transformation into a movement of transformation. And I built the internal environmental justice campaign, the environmental justice committee. I became a member of the Sierra Club. I rose up through the ranks to become a group leader. Then I became the chapter chair, which was first African-American chapter chair in the state of New York, and which caused, as you know, a lot of controversy. But the point was, it was about removing the separate and unequal treatment, even within the environmental movement. So that pioneering work began in the 90s in the Sierra Club. And then I rose to the national level because I realized the states were nothing more than a reflection of national policy. So to correct really the white supremacy within the movement, I knew I had to become a national player and a national actor. And so taking all my expertise as an environmental activist and frontline activist and dealing in toxics, they don't care whether you're white, black, blue, green, gay, straight, doesn't care. It will poison you. Chronic exposure will take your life and damage your health. And so taking that up to that next level and building those relationships, going into the mountaintop removal, the black lung, the poor whites who, because of economic hardship, are taking the lung-killing jobs in the coal sector. So we built that early solidarity that would become the National Coal Movement, and working with the Indigenous Environmental Network, building that solidarity and bringing their movements in. Like I said, Sierra Club was reviled by a lot of communities of color because they did have a bad legacy, and I can attest to that. But the other piece of it is that there were other powerful people within the organization. And if I could lift and empower those voices, we can be pirates and take over the whole thing and bring down the organization from its old culture to a new culture, to a new day. It just goes to show, you can always have these rises, you can always have these beautiful intentions, but you cannot guarantee that people come to the movement with your heart, your love, and your passion and your insights, but I try to be around and be a mentor as long as I can. Now I'm running for national board again, but unfortunately I'm not endorsed because the very people that I brought in now see me as a liability because I defended John Muir. And reason why I defended John Muir is very simple. There is no shortcuts. You must tell the truth. And not only did I defend John Muir, I intentionally and intellectually published it in a journal, a scholarly journal. I did not write a letter to the editor. I did not write an op-ed. You cannot fudge a scholarly article. And so the article has to be cited. The sources have to be fact-checked. They got a higher academic standard. And so to have a African-American defending John Muir, of all people and personages, I want you to understand what a statistical outlier that is. And I know about the 1,000-mile walking ways. Most people and most scholars tend to overlook it because most of them look at the environmental significance of John Muir's journey. But I, as an African-American from enslaved ancestry, know setting is part of the story. So I'm sitting here looking at a guy in 1867 walking through the South. Basically, the South is still smoldering after the Civil War. And here's a guy who was basically a draft dodger who could have served in the Union Army, now walking through the South, checking it out like a tourist who runs within that journey. By the way, it's a journal into 3 Confederate former soldiers, at least one of which was an officer, who were trying to engage him into making commentary. So you're looking at a document, which is his journal, his personal journal. And so you could be, as raw as you want to. And I tell people, there's more cussing in a chapter of Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn by Mark Twain than you will ever find in all of John Muir's works. One's considered high literature, taught in classes to this day. And the other one, like I said, it's an environmental tome that's revered by environmentalists, but they look at it from the environmental side. They don't look at it from the fact that John Muir saw the impacts of war and how destructive it was on the industrial scale of humanity and the environment. And what came out of that, he came out with a profound dislike of humanity. And that's why the Sierra Club, as Wendell Berry framed it, as the movement of the saves. I mean, they want to save the pristine vistas, but they don't deal with humanity. Well, that goes right to John Muir. And that goes right to John Muir's epiphany in the wake of the Civil War. And you got to understand the man in his time, that he says, my God, if this is what man does, I must preserve and protect nature. And I'm so heartbroken by the slavery, the racism, a civil war, and all this destruction and all this suffering that I'm witnessing of these people, these families, these lives are broken and destroyed. I'm retreating into myself and into the environment. So his flaw was to withdraw and elevate the environment above humanity. That's his flaw. That's his flaw. And most people who are Muir scholars actually skip it because they're just locked into the environmental side. But since I'm a descendant of slavery, I come with a different level of analysis. And it's that analysis and that frame I'm able to see a little bit deeper into the contextual setting of the man in his time. And it's from that I judge his writing. And then I understand the language, what he's using and how he's using it, and the art by which he definitely dodges open racism. He could have brought into it. Remember, this is his journal. Context matters. And so when people like the former executive director decides to take down monuments and go after John Muir, and then using non-scholarly sources and travel journals of people who are just opinion writers, and then passing that off as scholarly expertise as if it's an authoritative source, and then leveraging the fact that he's an executive director of the Sierra Club. So most people trust that if you are the executive director of an institution, you must know. They're going to defer. There's that institutional credibility that if you're speaking against your founder and saying he's a racist, then people are going to stop right there. They're not going to run out and read John Muir and fact check you. It's coming from an executive director. Why would an executive director say that John Muir was a racist if John Muir wasn't a racist? And so it took me as a board member to say, wait a minute, that is not true. Now, there were racists within the Sierra Club. There were white supremacists. There were eugenicists. One of the things about the naturalist movement was that there was that Darwinistic edge of the naturalist community, part of that legacy and that history. And so there were those members within. Joe LeConte, who was one of the founders, he epitomized that. And when I was president of the Sierra Club, it was my research that outed Joe LeConte and all the racists. One of the things I wanted to do to dismantle racism was to deal with the racists that were part of the founding of the Sierra Club. So I daylighted that. So I thought it was curious that the papers ran with this story on John Muir, and nobody said, wait a minute, you had a black president. Let's call him up and just fact check and see what he thought. So nobody did the fact checking. They just ran with what the white male said. And so all of a sudden, the black guy has to write an article, which doesn't make me popular with black folks, because it's easy to not say nothing. Because a lot of folks, why do you have to say something? It's just white people attacking white people. Because it matters. My name is in the 57th shoe print of that guy. The institutions matter. Because it was that institution that I used when I went to battle ultimately against an incinerator and all these other battles to give power to the environmental justice movement. I've moved the Sierra Club movement into these spaces to lift up our people. I can't fail them with cowardice acts of silence when I knew the truth had to be spoken, and the authority of that truth coming from me would have a very significant weight. And yes, it would be impactful. And so, yes, and that's why they did not select me to run again for the board of directors, because they're weak, because it's another form of white supremacy and white privilege. where you can think that you can tokenize and fetishize people of color in the movement. And when they don't serve your purpose, then you can all come together and then all of a sudden swing your Gucci bloated feet over the wall of oppression and out minority a minority. And then you're gonna cancel us. My point is like, listen, it was never about me. It was never about you. It's about the movement. And so in resisting, continue to resisting, I'm running because I'm running to make sure that the people know what's happening and the changes that are happening and the intellectual dishonesty that's happening, which is still another form of white supremacy, because the people that are leading the charge are not people of color.
First of all, you're incredibly brave. And so you have the ability to set narratives straight. Yeah. And then in that article for Earth Island Journal, you even compare John Muir to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a bold move. Can you tell me why you made that choice?
Well, it's bold because there's something called parallel syllogism. What is parallel syllogism? That's a highfalutin academic mouthful of saying when great minds think alike. This is the universality of great visions. This is the universality that we're all connected, that you cannot do something against one part of nature and expect yourself to come out whole at the end. And so you have the Buddhists that point out the sacredness of all life. There is this arc of this planet is 4.5 billion years old with an dynamic evolution of all sorts of organic species and flora and fauna and fungi. I mean, there's all these areas and all these kingdoms that we just don't have any clue about. But yet we're willing to pay for an industrialized solution to exterminate any one of them that gives us an inconvenience. And at the same time, poison ourselves. Think of people spraying their houses, because they got roaches, with every single toxic chemical known to man, and then poison, wonder why their kids are getting birth defects. We're going to pour all these pesticides on our foods and then wonder why the fertilizer plants and the plants that made these factories have now contaminated lands that nobody wants to live in, and it's been giving them cancer, But Dr. King went even further, because Dr. King talked about the inescapable reach out of humankind and how, as we do to one another, we do to ourselves. And what the genius of John Muir's insight that a lot of people don't get, I go back to the 1,000-mile journey that I gave you the insight on. Here is a man, why did he come to hate humanity? Because he saw all these connected things in humanity being the apex destructive force. And then he comes through his evolution. He comes from that dark space through his writings as nature heals his wounds and heals his soul. He comes to the epiphany that I've been cured by this thing that made me hate myself and hate my species as an apex species, to realize that all these things are connected and that we cannot pull and to separate one thing from another. These are actually a part of us. We got to own this. We got to own that evil and manage that evil. You can't excise it because it is part of these primal survival pieces, but it's all connected. Naturalists like John Muir took their lifetime in existence to come to that epiphany. Martin Luther King, in his short lifetime, came to that epiphany warning humanity that it's all connected. And that the means and tools that we have, that we can bridge these divides and understand these complexities, but even enjoy the beauty around us and the beauty of that which we even say is evil and ugly and what have you. That's a deep level. That's a very deep level. And so pulling our people through scholarship to the deeper level, to see the arc of great minds reminding us. We don't sit in the luxury of wagging fingers and that, this person's bad, we're going to cancel this person, we're going to cancel that. Like you got some magic, powerful wand, that you got something new in the 4.5 billion years of species and existence of this entire planet, and all of a sudden you think you got it. No. And coming, yes, from an African American, making that logical arc based upon his scholarship and his journey, walking the walk of civil rights and fighting for civil rights and human rights in my community against the incinerator, but also for justice and creation by wearing the 57 shoes of John Muir as the president of the Sierra Club. Of course, I have the authority and the right to make the claim and make the parallels so that people can see the greatness of these two minds as cures to our imperfect minds and our imperfect hearts.
You are a force of nature, and I feel so honored to have spoken with you today. Thank you so much for this, Aaron. I hope someone sponsors you. I want the books that you're going to write. I thank you so much and truly appreciate the time you've given us today.
Well, Dory, the pleasure's all mine. And it's these moments where, to the extent that I don't have a benefactor to put my words to pen, because I have to struggle, as all working class people do. I have to struggle to put food in my babies' mouths. But the point is that it is these moments that I've given to the world as a public intellectual, at least my musings and my feelings. And I just thank you and Jonathan for giving me the opportunity and time. And I say humbly, I thank you for at least allowing my words to be out there in the ether to hopefully change somebody's heart and inspire somebody's soul.
I know they will. I feel so honored and enriched to have spoken with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I must admit that when I first read the accusations against John Muir, I was quick to judge his actions and his philosophies. I was completely ready to throw any positive notions I had about Muir out the window. All of this without myself being a scholar on the subject or doing my due diligence in research or inquiries. Aaron, on the other hand, possesses a wealth of knowledge and insight and shared so much more perspective on both John Muir's life and actions, as well as the work of the Sierra Club. Muir's impact is part of an ongoing conversation regarding how we examine our history, our heroes and adversaries, and how we navigate conversations in order to move forward. It's interesting to note that in the aforementioned article, Pulling Down Our Monuments, Sierra Club director Michael Brune did not simply denounce Muir. He also listed several planned action steps that the organization would aim to prioritize as well, including posts on evolving issues on immigration, environmental justice, and indigenous sovereignty, shifting $5 million to make investments in their staff of color and environmental and racial justice work, and an apology. We don't have clear answers, and the questions never cease. The opinions vary with each and every individual, each different perspective and experience. Scrolling through message boards online brought me to several of those opinions regarding both Muir and the Sierra Club. Some people question who else's past we might re-examine, even more that none of us are 100% above reproach. Others call out the Sierra Club for being mostly white and ask to, quote, make the organization inclusive, diverse, equitable, down-to-earth, and really useful to everyone. Another states that, quote, you are moving the Sierra Club and the world a step forward in the awakening that is happening around us. And one more says, quote, everyone is a flawed mix of all their actions and beliefs. I don't know of anyone besides Muir who's climbed a tall tree to experience a high Sierra thunderstorm. This flawed man was more at home in the mountains than with people. Acknowledge, forgive, recommit. The trail ahead is still quite steep. John Muir died on December 24, 1914, in Los Angeles at the age of 76 of pneumonia. During his lifetime, he published over 300 articles and 12 books, after having devoted most of his life to setting up and preserving our national park systems and the treasure of our wildlands, work that is still crucial today. Edith Wharton once wrote, there are two ways of spreading light, to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it. As we continue to ask questions, we will wrestle with multiple answers, which can all hold truths simultaneously. How can we find our place within the continuing story of conservation and environmental justice that began so long ago and forges onward today? What actions can we do to be kinder and inclusive stewards of the land? Even more, whose voices should we listen to, include, and amplify? The article Aaron co-wrote leaves us with a bit of hope when it states, "The environmental community is engaged in a deeply important conversation about equity. It holds great promise for a more inclusive, diverse, and powerful movement, one that is progressing toward an equitable future while confronting some of the troubling aspects of its history." If John Muir can transform from a narrow-minded Scottish immigrant farm boy to a global citizen who understood the interconnectedness of all life, so can we. Thank you for joining Tree Speech today.